Right, thank you for a small number of you that have joined live. The rest of you watching this back on replay. Just for a little bit of context as to some of my excitement, bit of my excitement will be just sharing some new stuff that I've just been asking some questions about myself, having taken a number of things probably for a little bit for granted, of like, okay, you know, blah, 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 this does this does that, and then just like going, okay, that's what it is, and then teaching it, and actually starting to just ask that, being like a little kid and just asking those questions of just going like, why? And then not being able to answer that and then finding out, and then there'll be some more whys. And if you have any why questions as we're going along, if you watch on replay, just email me afterwards. If you're joining live, then there's a small number of us live, so feel free to just jump in and use the chat box, or you know, you can just jump in and mute yourself and go from there. The other bits of excitement is there's a couple of people joining live from literally Australia and New Zealand, and it's like an ungodly hours in either the middle of the night or in the early morning. So and they've said that they're interested to see me teach. So then now there's some additional pressure on to perform well. But we'll see how we go. We can let them be the judge of that. I'm going to share my screen and just get into it finally. Science of breathing. Here we go. Right. Screen share. Here. Present. Come on, computer. It's hanging on. Right. So first and foremost, everyone hear me okay? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, cool. Right, first and foremost, thank you for joining, and whether that is live or on replay. I appreciate your time, your attention, and you know, this is, I do a number of free things. This isn't free. We're trying to delve into some stuff a little bit deeper and answer some of those why questions that I've personally had. And I always think of, well, I say always think of my father, who passed away early this year, used to always say that if you've got a question, or you find something difficult to understand, chances are, and this is because he was a very intelligent man, he was a geophysicist. He was like, you know, if you've got a question, everyone else will have a question as well. Or if you don't understand something, everyone else probably doesn't understand it either. But that's because he was so clever. But for a lot of us, certainly we do have those questions, and when we answer some of those questions, I hope that it will help with those of you that are watching. Just very, very briefly, I think everyone knows sort of who I am or what I'm doing or why I'm doing it, and the Oxford Vantage. But just to recap, or just very quickly, just that Oxford Vantage basically being based on science and research, and we're going to delve into some of those. There's reference. I'll send out the slides for these. There's some references throughout. There's you know, you can get all that stuff and look at some stuff firsthand for yourself as well. And then just on me, I'm a master instructor, so I teach the Oxford Vantage. You can become certified with me as part of one of my jobs there. And I used to be a professional rugby player, so I like to try to take what we learn about breathing and apply it to sport. But equally, one of the most fulfilling things that I get to do is help someone, say, that's struggling with stress and anxiety, and just to feel calmer. And yeah, that's one of the most rewarding things about the work that we do. I love the work in like the professional sport. I love seeing what it does for my own performances in things. I'm trying to run a crazy 216 kilometer ultra marathon on next month, and I will be using every ounce of efficiency that breathing mechanics and nasal breathing can provide for me doing that, and that's great. But changing people's lives from a different angle rather than just making someone better at sport is actually potentially, well, depending on what side of the fence you sound, more rewarding. Okay, starting off with a little bit of philosophy, in that I've spelled his name wrong, he's put the R on Carlos Rovelli. He's a scientist, but also a philosopher, Italian. And there's a book that I'm reading that he's got, what's this book called? A brilliant book, like lots of just little chapters of little snippets of different things. But it's something like, I'm going to butcher the title of the book. I'll Google it afterwards. It's something like there's some places in life that are more important than being right, or something really nice in it, but it's quite a long, anyway, clearly it's that impactful that I remembered it. But there's this quote I love from him, and this is when he was quoting from, or he was paraphrasing slash he was explaining about all of the mistakes that Einstein made and why he was such an amazing scientist because of the mistakes he made. He wasn't amazing and made amazing discoveries and did everything he did because he got everything right and was right all the time. But he was pointing out the number of mistakes that he made along the way. And then even admitting he was wrong and blah, blah, blah. So, and I love this quote: what's important is not being right, it's to try to understand. And that's what we're going to be trying to do today, trying to understand along the way, along the journey of this understanding. And understanding the principles, and then whichever method, and use them in whichever method you like. But bearing in mind, this is my little thing at the moment, but bearing in mind, we used to think the world was flat. And so every time I'm currently, at the moment, when I'm teaching, I try to keep this slightly in mind of going like, be careful about talking in absolutes, because it's just whatever I show you now and explain to you now is what I currently understand from looking at what other people are researching, if you know what I mean. There's some practical applications that I've done myself, but am I asking myself, am I at the point where I think the world is flat and I'm teaching everyone about the world being flat? Because when I look outside my window, I can see it's flat. And it's like, it is actually flat. It's definitely flat. And this is, I'm reading another book on calculus, and like if you take a curved line and like zoom in on it infinitely small, like the idea that it's made up of like infinitely small lines that are straight, and then you can add up the straight lines. Like, am I currently teaching something that's just a little bit in here, and then in years to come, we're going to zoom out and be like, okay, it's actually a bit more like that. And potentially some of the things that we'll cover in this might help you to zoom out a little bit from something that we've potentially learned before. That's sort of the process I've been going through. Does that make sense? Where there are places in the world where rules are less important than kindness. Yes. Well done, Jane. Have you read that book? Class. No. Oh, well, do. Right. Phrenic nerve. This was something just to frame a little bit of moving from like the philosophy into, but framing a little bit of the where we're going to go into then the science. I found it very interesting. The Greek word "phren" translated to both mind and diaphragm. So the phrenic nerve being the nerve that innervates the diaphragm, the primary breathing muscle, and the idea that the Greeks believed that not that they were confused, like, oh, they had this word that meant two things, like, well, which one does it mean? Meaning that actually they understood back then that it meant the mind and the diaphragm, because how we think and how we breathe, these things are actually linked. And so I go a bit beyond though with I think about currently, we used to think the world was flat, but currently 4 things: breathing impacting how we think, feel, move, and perform. They're the sort of 5 subsections that everything that I currently teach with people, to me, feels like it fits into one of those things. And it's not like, those arrows are basically supposed to just suggest that like they're all like intermingled and can affect each other. Obviously, how you think can affect how you feel, and that can potentially affect how you're moving. Then how you're moving can affect how you're thinking, but that's going to affect how you perform. And then when you perform, you feel better, but then you think better. And so it's all intertwined. And breathing is potentially not necessarily behind all these things, but because it's something that's always on until you take your last breath. It is always on. We can't deny that. And so the fact that it's always there, and then where we're understanding how it impacts other autonomic systems within the body, then it has the potential, when we understand it a little bit better, to help us improve any one of these 4 areas. And that's what we're going to try and look at a bit today. were potentially going to be, or when I was putting this together, it started to feel like to me at the start that it was like these two like subset, these two big areas of like the neurology side of it and then the physiology side of it. And I also like those two words, sort of, it seemed to feel like it went quite nicely together. And then as I started doing it, it was like, you just couldn't separate. So the arrows come back in, because it's like, you can't really separate these things out because they just impact each other and they're so intertwined. But some of the things that we'll look at the brain stem in a little bit more detail. We'll look at muscle activation, which will come down under neurology, but it's going to affect how we move, and that movement side of it from a neurology base is the physiology side of it, but it's not in this order, is what I'm trying to say. We'll look at the autonomic nervous system, vagus nerve, performance, cognition, and I've referenced some things at the end, but just to say at the start. Some of you don't need to write these down because they're in the slides at the end that I'll send you, but some of the people that I just want to sort of recognize at the front where I've learned from. So Dr. Cobb from Z Health Performance, Dana Santos, who's mobilitymaker.com, and then Perry Nicholson from Stop Chasing Pain, and then obviously Patrick McKeown from Oxford Vantage. That's probably the four main people that I've been, and then the references of some of the studies that we're looking at are in there. But they're four people that if you've not really looked at in that much detail at some of the work that they do, and you find this stuff interesting, I would recommend having a look at them. Okay, so we're going to start like easy and ease our way in, mainly to warm me up so that I get these terms right. I'm also dyslexic, so when we get to some complicated words, cut me some slack on the dyslexia. Just because it's automatic doesn't mean it's optimal. Now, you've all signed up to a breathing thing, like you get it, but just this is one of those. It's the beauty of it, but also then the challenge of it when we're sort of teaching people, or people trying to understand it. Some people really find it difficult to get their head around the fact that just because something's automatic, it doesn't mean it's optimal. It's like breathing. Well, I don't need to think about it. Yeah, that's the beauty of it. It's that important that there is an automatic function within the brain to ensure that you don't stop bloody doing it. Unlike brushing your teeth or having a shower or whatever. But this is just framing the very soft bit around the neurology side of things, the brain. So when we're talking about the neurology, we're talking about the brain and the spinal cord, but how the brain sort of controls things. And there's only a few things that the brain is really interested in. Obviously, the brain is interested in breathing. It prioritizes breathing because it knows if you're not breathing, you're going to be dead. It needs oxygen supply to itself, and it prioritizes itself as well. So it's pretty clever. But it's very much concerned around safety and prediction and protection. So it's trying to predict what is going to happen. Am I safe, effectively? And it will always fall into the sort of automatic or trap of the path of least resistance when we're talking about sort of movement. I think of this as a strength and conditioning coach. If you see someone do a squat and they squat really badly because, say, they've got a weak core and tight hip flexors, the body is finding the path of least resistance. It's give it the task, do a squat, and it finds the path of least resistance. Now, it might not be the best looking squat, and it might not be the most functional, it might actually be good for the person's knees or whatever, but it's finding the easiest way to do the thing. Where's the least amount of resistance? And that's the same with the breathing. Breathing is a movement pattern. It's just a slightly different movement pattern in that you do it so many times during a day. But there is, like any movement pattern, there is muscle activation, there is joint articulation. We're talking about the rib cage, and we're talking about the diaphragm in simple terms. So it is something that therefore can be trained and we can do more optimally. But the good news is that there is the automatic part of it. That just shows us how important it is. And rather than overlooking breathing in terms of how it's going to affect how we think, feel, move, and perform, I'm trying to encourage people to look at other ways we can optimize it. Scott saying the brain is designed to keep you safe and not happy. Yeah, exactly. Okay, in terms of breathing, just again, this is just like the framing part of it. This was a scary statistic. I don't know if anyone's seen it. Just recently, May 2022, from the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. 91%, what was that? Dysfunctional breathers in the athletic population. Throughout, I can't remember the exact range, but it was like from young to adult. That if someone was the athletic, so basically, if you are exercising or take part in physical exercise, you're 91% likely to have dysfunctional breathing, showing that this automatic function that potentially goes unnoticed at rest, when you put a demand on it from exercise, you expose that dysfunction. It's like, okay, now it's coming out. So if we aren't aware and we're not, and we can potentially, you know, James Nestor's done some interesting work around like how the skull has evolved and what some of the reasons why we might become more dysfunctional breathers. I think that and we can argue or we can theorize why we're so prone to being dysfunctional breathers. But I think what we're sort of seeing now is just the reality that when you aren't exercising and you're a dysfunctional breather, you actually don't know it. And then when you start to exercise, you still might not know it, but it's easier. It's going to exasperate a poor pattern. So something that if you're involved in as a coach, it's obviously very, very important, because the dysfunctional breathing has a cascade of effects on our human sort of neurology and physiology, as we'll look at. Okay, so just literally one slide just to clear off some very sort of simple basics. And this is one of my favorite things or concepts, that in life you're either breathing in, breathing out, or holding your breath. There's just literally three things. There's other stuff you do on top of that in your day-to-day life, granted, but one of those three things has to be happening there. And there is a cycle that is in, and we'll look at the brainstem, how it works on that, but there is a cycle within the brainstem that is modulating that, allowing that to happen, and dictating the timeframes of those different sections of the breath. And I guess the idea is, if we understand it a little bit better, we can use those things to our advantage to change and improve the way we think, feel, move, and perform. A base sort of respiratory rate that we'd be looking at will be 10 to 12 breaths per minute at rest. It's one of the simplest things that I know we can do, like the control pools or Bolt score, as it's known as in the Oxygen Advantage. There's max exhale test, the guy that Brian McKenzie at Shift Adaptive from the freediving world. There's a number of different ways we can do testing of our chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide and breathing. But one of the simplest things that anyone can get a little bit of a gauge of doing is how fast are you breathing? That's going to tell us a little bit around the habits of that breathing in, breathing out, holding the breath, the rhythm that the system is sort of currently set to as a base level of habit. And the concept that if you're doing it inefficiently, you're definitely going to be doing more of them. And it's all work, it's all energy, it's all effort that the body has to do to just keep you alive as a base. So the concept of doing it more efficiently, well, then you don't have to do as much. Like this, as the system is less stressed before you've gone and into the big bad world. Size of a typical normal breath about 500 milliliters. So size of the breath being the fancy word for that, or term for that, would be tidal volume. So we'll revisit that later. And then just understanding from an efficiency point of view that like all tissues need oxygen, and we've got that sort of 4 stages that I will personally teach when I'm talking about breathing for people, and trying to affect the efficiency along that journey of how it's coming into the body. So, you know, whether you're getting it in through your nose or your mouth. Then where into the lungs we're breathing into, so breathing lower down, that's where the greatest amount of blood is because of gravity, and the greatest density of alveoli low down in the lungs, harnessing nitric oxide when we're breathing with the nose, etc. And then that transfer from the lungs into the blood, and then finally the transfer out of the blood into the tissues itself, and that's where the Bohr effect comes into play, that concept that the carbon dioxide as a catalyst allows oxygen to be released from red blood cells. So just sort of framing the basics from where we're going to move on from in here. Okay, so now we get a little bit more technical, and I don't want to get bogged down in these, but I'll put them on there as a to highlight just a couple of key things. One major thing from this slide is literally going, holy moly, there's a load of muscles I've never heard of before. Like, what are they? Like, but don't worry about what those things are. That's one thing. And but the major thing being like, oh wow, there's a lot of muscles involved in breathing. Yeah, so breathing will influence, and all these muscles are attaching. You know, your tongue attaches only at one point, but your other muscles attach at different. Interestingly, not that the tongue's involved in the inhalation or exhalation process, but the position of the tongue is obviously important. But muscles typically have two attachments, and therefore they have the potential to influence joints above and below the chain. And then one thing that's wrapping all of these muscles is fascia. And so from what we know about fascia, we know those things are connected. So don't get bogged down necessarily in the detail of like, oh crikey, I didn't know what like that muscle is, but just getting an appreciation that there is a lot of muscles involved, and we have primary and we have secondary, and the difference between those two is going to be impacted by the demand of what the thing is that we're trying to do. So when I'm breathing at rest, I want my breathing to be more relaxed, more gentle, and I want it to be, I don't need the help of the secondary breathing muscles on the way in and on the way out. But if we never train, if we're going to take part in some challenges, whether that's physical or mental, where our breathing is going to be challenged, then understanding how to breathe well at more challenging intensities is important. And yeah, I'm going to come out of the screen. I want to just come out of the screen share just quickly, just to emphasize one point, that on our sort of simple level, the infrasternal angle that the rib cage, those two lowest ribs make with your sternum and your breastplate, we want that to widen. We want that to come. We want those ribs to articulate out and expand. External rotation and extension on the way on our inhalations, they move out, and then on the exhale, they want to come in. So then the opposite would be flexion, internal rotation. At rest, that's dead easy because it's going to be small. Okay, but what's we're just going to come slightly more side on. What's challenging during a portion of work that I've personally not appreciated until more recently is, and I actually got taught this a while ago, but it's sort of one of those things that you get taught and you just forget about, or you don't think it's that important, that on my inhalation, if I struggle to get the ribs out, there's another way that I can get the rib cage like lifting up, and that'll be like a more global extension pattern coming from the spine, as well as, because the typical one would be like, oh yeah, shoulders get involved. But how many people do we see sat in and stuck in like extension patterns? The other major issue is getting the ribs down and in together on a good exhale. Now, if I've got like a well-developed six-pack, abdominal muscles that want to try and get involved in like crunching patterns for me all the time, and it's like chicken and egg, but if I lack good exhalation articulation of my rib cage, I can't get them down and in together, and I'm working hard and have to exhale hard, rather than the ribs doing the movement to get the air out, so the ribs like squeezing in, so internal rotation and flexion, the ribs going down and in together, I will flex the spine to pull that sternum down towards the belly button to force that air out more aggressively, when I can't just rely on the natural elasticity of the diaphragm and the lungs. So being able to exhale well by rib articulation rather than spinal flexion is a really key thing, just on mechanics, being not just below ribs moving and coming back together, like and prepping people, particularly if we're working with people that are on working in sports, the ability to expand well but the ribs moving rather than it just being the spine, and then being able to get the air out well, it being rib articulation rather than just spinal flexion. So being aware of your spinal position, and just points of reference being your sternum and your belly button. Like if you do that's because I want to make this I want us to have elements of practical throughout this, not just pure teaching. If you sit like upright, and then you just make 2 points of reference, your belly button, and your sternum. And then try and do a strong exhale. And just notice how, if you're like me, my body's desperate, the path of least resistance, remember, desperate to flex the spine, rather than keeping the distance between my belly button and sternum the same, and now exhale strongly. I have to work hard to maintain a better upright position, and I feel the activation through those obliques way more to actually get those ribs moving. Something very, very simple, but important in terms of our rib articulation, particularly when we're talking about working at higher intensities. Yeah, the potentially the athletes that we're working with are concerned about the inhale, but that's just one part of it. Yes, we can work on rib inhale, expansion on inhale, and I do a whole load of stuff on that on the sports performance seminar and course that I do. But the exhale is just as important and gets overlooked a little bit. Could we fit those that are live? Could you feel like how you wanted to flex compared to staying upright, or is it just some? Depending on if you've got real good like rib articulation coming inwards and down, like you've got no problem. But it's something to look out for people that we're working with. How is their breathing? Not just like looking at their rib movement, but what's happening with their spine. Where is the body finding that path of least resistance? Yeah. So the abs will engage to get we want so your abdominal muscles will be working. Look here. For the secondary breathing muscles on the exhalation, they'll be working to bring the ribs down and in together, but we want it to be the ribs moving more so than just the spine flexing. And Stacey asked that question. Oh, good point. Okay. A little bit, just seeing what these look like, or some of this looks like a little bit from a pictorially is useful. So our diaphragm is up here. And one thing to note is we have these like two domes. It's one muscle, but we have these two domes. The white stuff is the fascia. So a lot of fascia. And again, this isn't an actual, I've watched a dissection. When you watch a live dissection of something, it's, it puts things in a little bit of a different perspective, but this is a diagram. So it's, but it's a fairly decent one. Some things to note. This right-hand side one is not the same size as the left, larger on the right-hand side. Yeah, we're looking at the person. These are the attachments from the diaphragm down onto the spine, attaching thicker and lower on the right-hand side compared to the left. Other important thing, other stuff that will just get an appreciation that like psoas major coming up, QL on either side, iliacus, like these tissues connecting to each other, but then fascially coming in and connecting to portions of the spine where the diaphragm attaches, as well as literally like intersecting and fascially connecting to each other. How I move this muscle up here in terms of my breathing is going to influence how these muscles feel down here, and that will influence what's going on in the pelvis, what's going on at the spine. I think it's just a nice one to make that pretty clear from visually. Yeah. And then just one looking up at the diaphragm, just to give you a little bit of a different perspective on it. There's the cut through of psoas and the QL, seeing how closely linked and connected that they are fascially. And then we've got this like the idea of that thicker, longer attachment coming down to L4 on the spine from the right hand side compared to the left hand side. So just getting an appreciation of that. We're going to touch on that a bit later as we go through some of the stuff. Okay. In terms of neurology, what's causing us to breathe? Welcome to the brainstem. So what's causing us to breathe? When I started out, like the concept that carbon dioxide was like the trigger for breathing was like whoa, that was like when I read that in the Oxford Advantage book for the first time, it was like, that was a bit of like a wow moment. And then probably for a very long time, I was like, carbon dioxide, like, and didn't really appreciate the fuller picture. I was looking at the world being flat and like not being able to zoom out. So the brainstem is where we have the respiratory center, and it has like 3 sections that we've currently identified. At the top, the midbrain; in the middle, the pons; and lower down, the medulla. Okay, where we have the respiratory centers. There's not just one respiratory center. We have different centers within the brainstem, and they're still finding new stuff out. Okay, I'll tell you about one thing they're doing with, I've seen a study they're doing with frogs at the moment, but they've not been nice to frogs, and I like it, plants and animals and frogs. But anyway, so it's not me that's doing it, but they're doing some stuff, which just gives us a little bit of context. So the receptors for breathing, so there's a lot of stuff going on in the brainstem, but the receptors for breathing, those chemoreceptors have the central and they're the peripheral. So in this, we're going to, in the brainstem, we're talking about these central ones. Okay, we'll touch on these a little bit, but these central ones, and understanding that basis that yes, the central chemoreceptors are most responsive to changes in carbon dioxide because of the change that they have in pH, whereas our peripheral ones are responsive to pH and carbon dioxide, but are also monitoring levels of oxygen. It's just that they have to drop much more dramatically, more like 50% in the production saturation for those to like us to be commencing breathing because of oxygen being low. Okay, and that's like the typical thing that we learn. 7.4, so a typical thing we learn being like, it's the central chemoreceptors in the brainstem that are responsive to changes in carbon dioxide. Yeah, that's because we need to get rid of carbon dioxide, but not that it's this waste gas, but that, like, okay, so these were some of the questions that were starting to come up for me. The carbon dioxide has an effect on the pH. So pH of the blood wanting to be 7.4. And then starting to ask some of these questions of like why, and pH, interesting with pH, like it's a log scale. So like a very small change in pH, like extrapolates out like significantly. And the brain, we talked about like safety rather than being happy, like it's important that the pH stays within quite fine margins. Otherwise, literally we can die. So it wants to keep it within 7.35 and 7.45 currently. For a lot of those metabolic processes that the body has to do. And these processes produce a lot of acid, and the body has a complex system of feedback loops to help regulate that. Like the kidneys can process and deal with and help balance the acidity, but that's a much longer process than breathing. Breathing is happening all the time, whereas the kidneys, there's one thing, is going to take more like a day or two, or certainly hours, rather than moment by moment fluctuations in pH. Now, a lot of the acidity is brought about by the carbonic acid that is created. So about 65% of carbon dioxide is converted to carbonic acid, and that's so it can be transferred in the blood, and then it is expelled through the lungs. So it will be carried as carbonic acid, and then will transfer back into carbon dioxide for us to breathe out. The pH, saying pH of the blood wanting to be around 7.4. The carbonic, like the carbon, it becomes a more complex process when you look into it, around like how is that transfer taking place, and how is the oxygen being carried by the red blood cells and the hemoglobin sites, and then actually the H+ ions that get created because of the carbonic acid dissociating, and the red blood cells having places for the carbon dioxide to actually be attached to and carried as well. But essentially, the understanding that carbon dioxide is creating acidity within the blood, and we have to manage that. There's a study we'll look at a little bit further on around how can that understanding of how the body deals with this acidity influence how potentially we can help people increase performances. Okay, but the question I had was going through all that. I go, okay, great. So carbon dioxide, that's the thing. Read it in the book, great. But it's like, why? And this is the thing that I found really funny. Like, I've taught quite a few people now through the certification, and it's like no one ever stops at that point and goes, well, why isn't it oxygen? Like, why isn't it oxygen? Like, it just seems a bit of a backwards like way to do it, because it makes it sound like oxygen's not important, but then we can't hide away from the fact that like it is important. It's like the most important thing. If you're not getting oxygen in, then you can't your brain can't last for very long without oxygen. When I had a brain injury in 2013, and it took me a year to be able to get over my symptoms. And in the acute phase of the first few months, like I wasn't exactly like starved of oxygen to my brain, but oxygen supply and blood flow to the brain was disrupted. And it's like, you can't do anything. You literally can't think straight. And that's just like a restricted amount by probably only a tiniest little bit. And when we notice this, like when we get like brain fog in the afternoon or whatever, or just when we're too stressed, or these types of things that we'll talk about a little bit. But yeah, I found it interesting as to why we weren't answering that question, or why no one was asking that question. Why I didn't ask it at first either. Why isn't it oxygen? And I think there's a couple of bits I thought was interesting that just I try to just like rationalize things, like just what makes sense. And if you come across stuff like, can I rationalize it in my own mind? Does this make sense to me? And hopefully it then makes it clear for people as well. When we're breathing, about 75% of the oxygen that we breathe, or the air that we breathe in, like goes back out. Like we're only using about 25% of it. So the change is nowhere near as great moment by moment or breath by breath as what's happening with the carbon dioxide. Okay, so whereas the carbon dioxide, even I had someone ask this question before, around like we were doing some, say if you're doing like an extended box breathing drill. So you might have like a classic box being 4 in, hold for 4, 4 out, hold for 4. An extended box would be like having the exhale twice as big as the inhale. And the idea that on the exhale we're breathing out carbon dioxide. And I was describing this, or we were practicing this as a drill, in a group setting, to as a bit of this can be a way you can work on your breath control and your chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide buildup. And someone asked a great question. They're like, but why does it get harder as I do the long exhale? Like I'm breathing, if CO2 is my trigger to breathe and I'm breathing out for a long time, why is that helping me with my CO2 sensitivity? And like, why do I find it harder to do a long exhale? And I was thinking, that's a great question. And like to sort of simplify it or like take it one step further. If carbon dioxide is our stimulus to breathe in, well, couldn't I therefore, in theory, just breathe out forever? I mean, I can do quite a long exhale, but but you can't. So in theory, you sort of think, well, yeah, no, but I know I can't, because there is always that loop, the breathe in, breathe out, hold the breath. There's always that loop we're going to come back to, for one. And then also, when you're slowly exhaling, yes, you're getting rid of some carbon dioxide as you go, but the body is recreating more carbon dioxide as we go. And there is some mechanisms within the brainstem that's like modulating that, like, okay, after exhaling, I know what's coming next, is inhale next. Like it has that program in it. So it's waiting for and expecting that. And your carbon dioxide levels can still be rising, even though you're exhaling, particularly when we're doing slow exhales, not exhaling as fast as it's being generated. But I love questions like that, because it makes you have to like think about things a little more rationally. Okay, so carbon dioxide, in my rational way of looking at as to why it is the case. It's having the opportunity with our breathing to control and modulate that fluctuations in pH in the blood much more stringently, much more carefully than if it was using oxygen, because of those oxygen levels not changing as much moment by moment and breath by breath. Okay, so there's all sort of, depending on where people are at with their understanding with this, is like sort of relatively basic to a degree. And then looking at the that phrase I had at the beginning, just because it's automatic doesn't mean it's optimal, is taking away something being automatic being potentially not complex, or it's too simple because it's automatic. But this is about appreciating, not getting sort of bamboozled by it, but just appreciating the complexity of the simple act of breathing, the inhale, the exhale that just happens automatically, the number of processes that are going on to make that thing happen, and having an understanding of what's changing those things is hopefully going to allow us to understand a little bit better, so that ultimately the whole aim of this whole thing for me is helping me and you and everyone else to understand, when I'm doing something, what is it that I'm doing, so that I can then choose, do I want to do it this way, or do I want to do it a different way? Is it right for me now? Those types of questions when I'm talking about how you're breathing during a specific exercise, specific drill, or specific like breathwork practice. Do you know what it is that you're doing, or to the best of your knowledge? Okay. And breathing is complex, a complex pattern, movement pattern, and when we look at even taking something like the example we gave before, the movement pattern, like a squat, like these things that are sort of simple on the outside when you look at it, but then you start looking at like what makes like a muscle fire, like it's just insane. But there are, as it says here, like numerous motor neurons distributed along the spinal cord, firing a specific, sequences to allow us to do that very simple act of breathing that we just take for granted, that we go to bed at night and it just carries on, and we wake up in the morning and it's still just there. And whether we think about it or not, it's still going on. Now we're going to visit the brainstem in a little bit more detail now, and we're looking at mainly the reasons when we talk about the lower part of the brainstem, like the pons and the medulla, but there is stuff that the midbrain, which is at the top, does influence as well. But we're looking at like the rhythm, or the speed at which we're breathing, and the pattern formation, so like the speed as well as the size of the breath as we go through this. We talked about the Greek word phrenic, the phrenic nerve being the one that actually innervates the breathing muscle, the diaphragm. Okay, so with that in mind, like the brainstem, in terms of these different sections, just a little reminder for us here, like that top section being the midbrain, we're going to be interested mainly in like the pons and the bottom section, the medulla. And these respiratory centers contained in these there's different when it's like normal sort of like at rest breathing compared to like high demand or more active breathing. So the medulla, which they call the dorsal respiration center, is in normal breathing involved in the rhythm and rate of the inspiration. Okay, so like at what type of rhythm, what type of speed, we're talking about rate, like what type of speed am I breathing in? So if I'm asking someone to count their breaths per minute, and they count them and they're like, I'm 20 breaths per minute, and I'm like, okay, well, you're breathing at a faster rate than you need to. It doesn't tell me about the size of the breath they're taking, but it does tell me about the rhythm and rate that they're breathing at. And that's a very simple one that anyone can do and understand. But it would be, I'm basically making some sort of assessment of the medulla. Now, it doesn't matter whether you know that you're assessing that or not. No, but having it, and you don't need to explain this to anyone you're working with, that you having a deeper understanding of this is beneficial. It's at the bottom of the brainstem, so it's this lowest one, this distal one, so the bottom one, and it's getting its. We'll visit the vagus nerve later. It's getting its information from the vagus nerve. So people have come across some of the slower breathing that's important for vagal tone. We're going to do some. We're going to do a practical with the vagus nerve that you may or may not enjoy, depending on how free you like to let your emotions go. But so you got that to look forward to. The pons is this one here in the middle, and it is more influential in the size of the breath. So it does that by inhibiting the amount of filling that's happening in the medulla. It's a little bit of like a protective mechanism. So it starts, if you do it, we'll use this for a muscle activation thing later. But if you start to take a really big inhale, and you get to the point where there's some sensory information going back to the brain of going oh, we're stretching the lungs here quite a lot. Let's just calm down. So that's a part of that protection mechanism again, and it'll inhibit the medulla to stop expanding, and then we have that exhalation afterwards. So that's what's going on in terms of the speed and the size of the breath. One coming from the medulla, one coming from the pons. There's some interesting / weird / animal cruelty, but they do it when they do things, don't they? And when they're doing research on things. But for some reason in frogs, I don't know why in frogs, but there was where they're basically trying to manipulate. They're trying to watch their breathing and then mess with a different part of the brainstem, take out the pons. If we take out the pons, what happens? We think the pons is affecting their ability to not finish breathing. And there was some weird stuff where they would I think take out the midbrain. Don't quote me, but it was something like they took out the midbrain and they had their inhale and exhale, but then they stopped having their pause at the end of it. So they would to get an understanding of what bits of the brain or the brainstem is affecting what bits of the breathing pattern. They're trying to manipulate to then see what happens effectively and find out. So there are, and they're sort of getting, it's a bit this is new, we're confused, we don't really know what's happening, we're just experimenting. So this is the type of stuff of where the world is flat. This is where we are at the moment. Medulla affecting the speed, the pons affecting the size of the breath. And this is important when we're teaching people to control their breathing better. That's at rest. During high demand breathing, so during more physical exercise, there's a ventral respiratory group in the medulla, which at rest isn't active. But then when we start working hard, that starts to kick in there, and that works on both the inspiration and the expiration. And you go, well, that makes sense, because at rest, there is no expiration thing here. What's triggering the exhale? Well, the exhale is taking advantage of the elastic recoil of the lungs, diaphragm, and the cartilages. That's happening automatically at rest. Yeah. But when we start, anyone that's gone out running or done any sort of harder exercise knows that when you're exercising, you work hard on the inhale and then you work hard on the exhale as well. So there's something else kicking in at a certain point when the demand for oxygen starts to go up, and the amount of carbon dioxide that's being generated is going up, and the body needs to, and it knows it needs to get rid of it because the effect it's having on the pH. So something going on that's managing, and these will still be involved in the active. We've just got something else going on as well. Interestingly, that being located in the medulla. And I'd be absolutely convinced in another 10 years or 20 years or X number of years, they will then go, oh, and this bit also does this, and this bit also does this. This is not the end of the story of what governs our breathing, but it is where we're currently out with it. Okay. So taking that and going like, okay, great, but like, what's the point? Like, why do we need to know this? Why are we messing with frogs to try and find this thing out? But understanding very simply, very simple like equation around ventilation. If we're talking about minute ventilation, like the amount of air going through in 1 minute, the RR being respiratory rate, so that rate, that speed, how many breaths in a minute am I taking, being governed more so by the medulla, and the TV standing for tidal volume, so the size of the breath, that being dictated more so by the pons, and the speed at which we breathe and the size of the breath being linked together, because they combine to influence our ventilation. If I, and the brain wanting to keep us safe and keep things normal, if I reduce my respiratory rate, it's one of those, it's a very simple equation, but it's one of those beautiful things around like mathematics of going like, okay, well, if I reduce that, I just make that bigger and that stays the same. So the brain wants you to keep your ventilation where it is because it's got its chemosensitivity set. Whereas when we introduce breathing exercises, particularly something like a breathing light exercise, where ultimately we're trying to reduce the ventilation to actually then have an impact on chemosensitivity. Just slowing down the breathing, so just slowing down the respiratory rate, if we don't do anything about the size of the breath, isn't actually going to impact the ventilation. So this is where these two bits are important and where they come into play in a real practical element. It doesn't matter whether the person, whether you know or I know what the thing is, but it's where it comes into the practical application, and knowing that the brain has got these different receptors in the brainstem and different parts of the brainstem that it's just going to modulate. When I slow my breathing down, it wants to breathe bigger, so my ventilation stays the same. If I try and take a smaller breath, it wants to breathe faster to keep my ventilation the same. I can reduce both of these two things to have a dramatic reduction in this. But if I reduced my respiratory rate and just kept my tidal volume the same, then I'm affecting ventilation. But then you flip it on its head and go, well, that's a breathing light exercise where we're trying to work on our chemosensitivity. What about exercising at high intensities, where I've got this high demand ventral respiration group kicking in, driving some active inhalation, active exhalation? Well, that's going to, if I can increase the expansion of my rib cage, I've got the potential to start to increase my tidal volume, the size of each breath. But then I've also got this forceful active inhalation, exhalation happening, so my respiratory rate can start to go up. So I can actually increase both these two things to increase my ventilation, which is going to be beneficial when I'm starting to exercise, because CO2 creation is going up and oxygen demand is going up too. Yeah. But there is an override. There can be a few different, so there's a few different things. I'm not an expert on like female health or female breathing, but as one little example of like a difference, during the menstrual cycle, the luteal phase, when progesterone is highest, we notice that our breathing changes, our chemosensitivity is affected by levels of progesterone. That's something that's now sort of well documented. And so someone's Bolt score or someone's breathing rate will change as a female through because of that. And it's like, well, if that's happening, like what other hormones and other things are affecting our breathing? I'm sure those things will, more and more stuff will gradually start to be understood. But that's just one little example. The obvious, or the more obvious example, and this shows how like the more so around like the stress response kicking in. So I don't know who she is, but it's just a video picture on thing. But she's obviously done the thing that everyone's doing now, isn't it? It's like just jump in a thing of ice, because I saw someone on BBC do it. And this is what's important, understanding what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it. But in this scenario, look, it's a great photo, mouth wide open, like a stress, and now all of a sudden I'm breathing stressed. And it's like, okay, but everything we've just talked about, and everyone's on board with this, right? You've like gone, okay, yeah, carbon dioxide, the respiratory center, blah, blah, got it. Like, yeah, the size of the breath and the tidal volume, etc. Like, What's her tidal volume like? As in the size of her breath. She's taking big breaths now. What's her respiratory rate like? She's going fast breaths now. What's driving that? Carbon dioxide? But she's not doing anything. So carbon dioxide chemosensitivity is important, but nervous system, stress response, mental state, what's going on in here is also important. And there is that overall function. She is dumping off CO2 now, but not because she's exercising, but because the system has noted another stress, which makes us realize, okay, so exercise in itself is basically, it's just a stress on the body, which a lot of you will appreciate already. Yeah. So in her scenario, it's not pH. And it's like, and again, trying to think rationally, and obviously it's like, yeah, we know that, like, we know when we're stressed, we breathe faster like that. But there's some interesting stuff, and this is how then, if anyone is, you're working with clients that are stressed, or I think someone on the call was doing Wim Hof stuff as well. The type of stress will influence how the breathing changes. So the type of stress is influencing the pons or the medulla differently. As the stress becomes more intense, the minute ventilation, so the respiratory rate multiplied by the tidal volume increases. Yeah. But as the stress increases, it's more so by frequency than tidal volume. And you go, yeah, okay, I think I get that. I think I could potentially even visualize that in my head. I see someone stressed, like she's jumped in, and then it's like, it's that type of breathing. And you're like, yeah, it's bigger than normal, but actually the main thing is that it's so fast. And that mouth provides very little resistance to allow it to be fast. So remember the brain going for the passive of least resistance. That's why that mouth opening is part of that stress response, because it wants to be fast. That's allowing it to be fast. You wouldn't be able to do that type of breathing easily through the nose, and therefore it's providing too much resistance for that sort of reaction or that stimulus. So the speculation that the breathing response comes down to the type of stress, the nature of the stress that it is. So when it's more metabolic or chemical, we get an increase in both the frequency and the tidal volume. So think of like, just very simply, like going on a run. So like the metabolic stress, my speed of my breathing increases. We notice that when running, and the size of the breath you want to take goes up as well. And those two things multiplied together gives us that increase in minute ventilation that we're after, because the body is requiring more oxygen and is creating more carbon dioxide that it needs to offload to help manage those pH levels. Non-metabolic or non-chemical things like, so thermal, so they're her, like the ice, or psychological, just like I'm panicking. Like I had an MRI scan on my brain again a few weeks ago, and I was stationary still in this machine. Zero change in temperature, zero change in metabolic demand. No one was doing anything to me at all, except there was these crazy noises going on, and I felt claustrophobic as whatever. And it was a traumatic experience, let's say. And my breathing was horrendous, and like it even hurt. And it was like, but nothing was happening to me. Like it was all psychological. And I was thankful at that time that I was like, come on, Jackie, you're supposed to be a flipping breathing coach, like work on your breathing. But it was, I found it intensely intense. But then weirdly got into a bit of it lasted about an hour and 20 minutes. It was a long MRI scan. And I ended up getting into like a bit of a hypnotic state. I say that for people watching the movie, Simon is a hypnotist. I got into a bit of a trance almost, in a way. And the really funny thing about it was, as soon as I was like, it'd gone from this like horrendous experience where I felt like I couldn't breathe to this like tranquility. And as soon as I was like I'm Zen or whatever, as soon as I had that thought of like, wow, this feels amazing, it was like, boom, it'd gone. And it was like, bang, 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 it was back. But that was purely psychological. Yeah. And the main thing that's happening when we're going, like, so if, like her jumping in the ice bath is, it's fast. The frequency, the respiratory rate increases rather than necessarily the size of the breath does. And that's still, again, rationalizing it still makes sense that when you're stressed like that, the speed increases, but the size of the breath doesn't. And, you know, typically we would know it like will go a little bit shallower. So, and when it's shallow, it's also not that, it's not that big. And hopefully that helps to, that explains a little bit of that like difference in tidal volume increasing. If we're trying to, when we're trying to coach someone or help someone, give someone tools of the breath, it's like understanding how there is the frequency or the respiratory rate, the size of the breath, the tidal volume, how those two things interact together to affect your ventilation, and understanding how different stresses will impact on those two sides of the equation. And then you can start, when you know the practical application of it is, when I know how it's influencing or what is likely to change, I can preempt that and start to think about, okay, slowing my breathing down, or I need to take a deeper breath. I can start to preempt and think about these things, and as well as teach someone away from the stress itself to be able to manage it better when the stress does come upon them. Okay. That then, so if that's about like stress, yeah. If that's about stress, like we have to talk about the autonomic nervous system and how this is linked in. So we've got those two arms to the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And it's not that one is on and one is off, and one is good and one is bad. It's this constant like fluctuation that's important, and the reactivity of the nervous system, that it can fluctuate. When there is a stress, it can come on, it can deal with it, and then we can come back, and we're constantly ebbing and flowing minute by minute of this. A system that is well responsive and responding appropriately to the different stresses that are placed upon it, whether that's internal or external, is important. And our breathing is intimately linked with our nervous system. So people that come across RSA, so the respiratory sinus arrhythmia, that is controlling the rate of gas exchange in the alveoli, and on how it's linked into the nervous system. On our inhale, the heart rate speeds up when the lungs are richest in oxygen. That's more sympathetic dominant. As the heart rate speeds up, it's more of like a stress response. On the exhale, the heart rate slows down. It's more parasympathetic rating when the lungs are richest or highest in carbon dioxide. And again, it's sort of like linking those two things, and hopefully like it makes sense, like why those things are linked in. And I just feel like we're starting to build up this then picture of like how the brain and the breathing and the nervous system, and how they're all just like working together and helping each other manage this complex system that is keeping us alive. And then, you know, within that we've got our vagus nerve, which is helping govern what's going on with this, as well as sending information back to the brain. We've already mentioned about sending information back to the brain around our breathing. So the vagus nerve, cranial nerve X, so the 10th cranial nerve, and this is where Dr. Perry Nicholson from Stop Chasing Pain does a whole like 18-hour seminar on just the vagus nerve, whereas I've got one slide. So if you want, like, if you're really interested in it, go and see the stuff that he's got. I've done that seminar, and it's very good. But the vagus nerve for us in terms of breathing, like, important when we're trying to influence the stress response and the nervous system, and it's sending information back to the medulla about our breathing. It's the longest nerve, visits all the major organs, and interestingly, you know, so far we've very much talked about the brain like top down, sending information back, dictating what we do. It's do this. When Whereas with the vagus nerve, it's gathering information and sending 80% of its information is going back to the brain. So it's like finding out, how is everyone, going and visiting all the different organs, going, how are we doing, guys? Like, how is everyone feeling? Are we doing all right? And if they're not doing so well, and it's like just everything's just getting a bit too much, and they're overstimulated, then it just dulls the whole thing down and goes like, too much information, like let's just dull things down. And if we need to, we'll just stay in that sort of, like, I'm simplifying things now, but we'll stay in that stress state, and we'll just help ourselves. If you're going to be like, generally all the information needs to be stressed, but it's just too much, I'm just going to like leave us on that stress mode, and dull down the rest of the information. That stops that reactivity of the nervous system. So having good vagal tone, as we would call it, is very important. With the breathing, one of the simple things that I've come across is the slower breathing rate. So 5.5 to 6 breaths per minute is what's been sort of well documented, and being less sensitive to carbon dioxide, so building up your carbon dioxide tolerance helps with that vagal tone, helps with that autonomic nervous system, helps with, then if that's working better, helps with that information going back to the brain. You start to work this whole loop. So, it's not just about CO2 sensitivity, but CO2 sensitivity has a massive effect on a lot of various different functions in the body. Scott's asked a good question around, can you measure vagal tone? I don't know if would be strictly vagal tone, but it would be influenced by vagal tone. It would be a heart rate variability. So heart rate variability is something that's become quite common or quite popular recently. Heart rate, HRV, as it stands for heart rate variability, is the time difference between heartbeats. So as we said here, like each inhale, we have a speeding up in the heart rate, and each exhale, a slowing down. There wants to be fluctuations within that. And a vagus nerve that's been dulled down will have, say, if you take an example of like a heart that's beating at 60 beats per minute, resting heart rate, we might think that symmetry is best, so that if it was exactly 1 second between every heartbeat, that would be good, because it's nice and rhythmical and symmetrical. But what that shows is like no reaction to what's going on in the environment. So the vagus nerve is supposed to be visiting all those different organs and having a chat and finding out, like, how's everyone doing? How's everyone doing? How's everyone doing? So if it needs to like change, it would do. And so with every inhale, this heart rate speeding up, and every exhale, the heart rate slowing down. We're going to see then these differences between heartbeats. There should be very, very small, very micro changes. But heart rate variability, so bigger changes in your heart rate, being good and a sign of it changing, which is then a reflection of good vagal tone. So it might not be a direct, like this is vagal tone, but it's definitely a sign of good vagal tone. So heart rate variability is something that people use. Yeah, Stacey asking about the what I forgot. What's the thing that dangles down? That's that was to do with if it's, I can't remember which way around. It's like if it's leaning over to one side, it's more like sympathetic stress, and you need to. Perry Nicholson covers it in one of his courses if you're really into all that stuff. Yeah, that's hanging down the back of the throat. Yeah, and if it's not central, like it should be sat central, but if it's leaning to the right, leaning to the left, then Dr. Nicholson says that it's there's something amiss with your nervous system, and then you need to work on your vagus nerve. So those of us that are practicing breathing or teaching people as a breathing coach, we'll have come across typically some slower breathing exercises to help work on our carbon dioxide sensitivity, and that's those slower breathing rates. 5.5 to 6 breaths per minute is good for vagal tone. Whether it's, this study's been done 5 in, 5 out, or 4 in, 6 out, like almost doesn't make a difference. Some saying that like 5 in, 5 out is better. a lot of us, I really like the longer exhale, trying to help promote that sort of parasympathetic activity. So I would typically use like 4 and 6 out when I'm trying to help people, particularly in a down regulation practice. But some simple things. We're gonna try a couple of bits together. So slower breathing, humming helps you to extend and exhale. So if you're all muted, so you can do it. Do a hum now. Now, I didn't, like, I'm talking normally still, that didn't make me out of breath, but a hum, remember in life, you're either breathing in, breathing out, holding your breath. It's got to be one of those 3 things. So the hum is an exhale, and it extends your exhale naturally, quite in terms of duration, without you having to really put any effort in. So it's good for that slowing down of the heart rate, that down regulation, that parasympathetic shift without putting effort and emphasis in. One of the parts of the vagus nerve travels through is your voice box. And so when we create those vibrations that the humming does, it helps to innervate and stimulate the vagus nerve. Now, stimulating the vagus nerve to try and wake him up so he can be a bit more responsive to help with your heart rate variability, your vagal tone, is good. There is like anything, like Goldilocks found out, too much of anything can be like too much. So when I did the vagus nerve course with Perry, he said at the beginning, and I knew it when he said it, I was like, I know, he said, don't do everything I show you in the next 18 hours or whatever it was, how long the thing was. It was like a whole day thing. It was like, don't do everything I show you, like just do some of them, but not all of them. Because like too much stimulation of it, you're going to feel absolutely smoked the next day. And this was done on Zoom. So obviously, what did I do? I was like at home and I just did all of them. And then literally, honestly, the next day in the morning, I felt like I'd been in a car crash, like I was just like absolutely wiped out. And it's like, but vagus nerve is good for you and parasympathetic is good for you. It's like, but too much of anything. And too much stimulation, but typically people aren't going to spend all day doing them, so it's fine. But it was just interesting to experience that, and I would obviously want to point out we're going to do just one little thing, okay, together. So I'm going to come out of the thing. I'm going to take this up. You're going to stand up for it. You're mute if you're live, you're muted, so you don't have to worry. But what you are going to do is we're going to make some noises. Okay, so the first thing I want you to do is I want you to be relaxed. Okay, and I just want you to bob up and down a little bit, just to create some vibrations. And that movement up and down can be good to actually help you relax your shoulders, relax your collarbones, literally relax your rib cage and your lungs in a way, okay? And then we said we had humming, so if I was to do a hum, okay, then rest, just stop, then just rest, stop, okay? But after doing that hum, you like go, how do you feel? Like, I feel a bit silly, or I feel nice, or I don't know, I just feel a bit awkward. It's like, no one's watching you, don't worry, okay? I want you to like be able to sort of like let go of this. But what you will have been doing when you were jumping down, you're creating some vibrations. When you're humming, you're creating those vibrations that's running through the voice box for your vagus nerve. And then the long exhale is helping you slow down your breathing and actually like you're working on a little bit of that CO2. Now we're going to try to create some different noises as we go, rather than just the humming. So one of them, we'll practice them separately. One of them is ah. So make an ah noise. Ah. And then we're going to go e. And then also you've got e, so we've got ah, e. And then I want you to go ooh, ooh. We're going to do it in this order. You're going to go ooh. And then we're going to go ah, and then for your e, e, and try and create, get the neck muscles in. So you're gonna Really crank the E. Vagus nerve comes down. You can do some stuff on your ear, whatever, but the vagus nerve comes down. We're going to actually get to interact with it. Okay, so we'll go through one together. The whole thing is on one exhale. So take a nasal light breath into here, and then come with me. Boo. Okay, and you might be a little bit like that, might have challenged your breathing, so it's making you extend that exhale. Okay, then we're going to do it with a bit of the bobbing. Okay, so little bump up and down, relax the shoulders, try and let go of any like inhibitions or worry about yourself or anything possible, and then take a breath in and then start. Ooh, ah, ee. Okay, now there is one little final section. If you're laughing, good, because when you're laughing, you cannot be sympathetic dominant. It's impossible. So we are starting to play with your brain as well. Now, the last bit, when you go to the E, you're going to try, cross your arms over, and you're going to tap just on your collarbones, like just above your collarbones. Okay, so again, some more vibrations into there. So we're vibrating with the jump, we're vibrating with the noises, E, and then when you do the E, you're going to get the neck muscles out, then you're just going to gently tap them. Okay, how hard? Just right for you. You're not trying to punch yourself in the face. Okay, so we're going to try and do 2 in a row with 1 breath in between. It makes sense? So you've got to control your breath with this. It's a very long exhale. Okay, so relax, bounce. Okay, and then breath in through the nose to the diaphragm, and then then inhale. Nice, control your breath in. Might feel a little bit like, ooh, a little bit out of breath, feel a little bit energized. Someone definitely does. Who's that? That's Stacey. Definitely feels energized. You may well feel energized, but at the same time, it's not in a stressed state because we're doing a bit of love. Please back in. A little bit of love for your vagus nerve. Just looking at some of the chat box. Okay. So with that, you're getting some vagus nerve stimulation. You are slowing down your breathing. You're getting some vibrations from, we weren't doing an actual hum, but we were getting some vibrations still going on. And the nice long exhale, plus generally makes people laugh, which I say is also good. And just adding a little bit of movement into potentially a breathing exercise with a little bit of added vagus nerve. But so I would typically do, like we did, like two breaths then, and can you stay in control? Then I did it like 3 times. Like the voo voo three times. Can you manage that exhale through that sequence? You can, as you improve your CO2 tolerance, you can increase the exhale. You can start to increase the duration of those the 3 different noises that you make, but try and make it sort of like rhythmical. That's my favorite once coming out of cold. Okay, cognition. So one of the things I said around like how you think, feel, moving forward, think like how is our breathing, how is those 2 things, the CO2, but then also the stress response, remember the stress response being that override, how are those 2 things potentially impacting how the brain works and cognition. A lot of us will hopefully have come across like the carbon dioxide effect in terms of increasing circulation and blood flow to the brain, and also that oxygen delivery to the tissues with the Bohr effects. You know, carbon dioxide being the catalyst that allows oxygen to be released from those red blood cells, but it's also helping drive increases in circulation as well. So someone like me that had a brain injury, improving carbon dioxide tolerance to help with circulation, blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain, really important. But the other side of carbon dioxide is interesting, that if we're more prone, so carbon dioxide calms the irritability of the conscious centers of the brain. If we're sensitive to carbon dioxide, we are more prone to panic attacks and panic or stress disorders, in that they've done studies where if you blast anybody, you blast someone with like pure carbon dioxide, I don't know if it probably killed, but they've done with like high levels of carbon dioxide. If you give someone enough carbon dioxide, if they've never had a panic attack in their life, like they will still have a panic attack. There's some sort of like override in that brainstem that's like, this is dangerous, and we panic, and it's like the panic is like to get rid of it, get rid of it, get rid of it, get rid of it. So even if someone has good tolerance of carbon dioxide and has never suffered with anxiety or panic attacks, if you give them enough carbon dioxide in their inhalations, they will have a panic attack. It will trigger a panic attack. So they know carbon dioxide is related to panic attacks and stress and panic disorders. Now, what we know is, if as a general, if you're a person in the general population world today, where we're all stressed, like stress is part of everyday life, but just in different ways. If I have good tolerance to carbon dioxide, I know I'll have calmer breathing, but equally, I know that I'm never going to get to that point where I feel like I'm having that carbon dioxide just blasted in my face. Whereas if I'm quite sensitive to carbon dioxide because I've got used to some dysfunctional breathing patterns, I breathe shallower, so I breathe faster, and I'm inefficient with those breaths. So I carry on doing that, and my chemosensitivity to CO2 gets disrupted, so I become more sensitive to it. That can actually start to trigger as if you were getting blasted with some CO2, in that like the psychological stress can then just change things, and that sensitivity to CO2 makes us, or is part of the trigger of that mechanism forcing someone into a panic attack. So if we're working with people that do suffer with panic attacks, which I have done, and like, stress management and that type of thing, not important to me not to say it's like, oh, it's your breathing, I can sort your breathing. Like, the breathing is a part of the puzzle, and it's a physiological mechanism behind what's going on. There's obviously some stuff upstairs that we need to work on as well, but this is one of the things in the background going on that you can do that's going to help you before you even worry about how you're thinking about the struggles or the stress that we've got going on in life. Does that make sense? So, like, the way I try to frame it for people is going like, let's just set you up for being successful with how you're going to cognitively deal with these emotional stresses. Meaning, like, get your brain in a state physiologically where it can, and that sensitivity to carbon dioxide is a huge part of that, which doesn't. You can help someone in terms of stress and anxiety without having to talk about stress and anxiety at all. We just work on your breathing and improve your tolerance to carbon dioxide. Okay. And then nervous system effect on thinking. So one thing we said like then was like laughing switches things in terms of compared to sympathetic dominance into parasympathetic. But also we've got the fact that like rational thinking, this again, it's just part of that fight or flight mechanism, that rational thinking being impaired as the prefrontal cortex gets inhibited during that sympathetic activity. We think of like sort of that tunnel vision effect, and that safety protection thing comes into play there, where when I can't see what's going on, like I'm in that protection mode. So being able to get out practically in get some of those panoramic views where of that, I just love that sort of like making it almost like an equation, like panoramic equaling parasympathetic. It gives us that like that headspace, but literally like understanding that it is influencing what's going on from a nervous system perspective. So if I'm stressed through breathing or stressed through my environment, and I've got more sympathetic activation, maybe my vagus nerve is dulled down, and then for my I'm not responsive as enough and I stay more in that sympathetic dominance, then it's difficult for me to think more rationally. And then my breathing being disrupted within that process as well, then I'm going, because I'm more in a state of fight or flight where I'm breathing faster, then I'm going to be offloading more carbon dioxide. And then these two things are starting to be linked in then together. And the nice thing for us to working in this area is if these things are linked in together, it gives us more than one tool or more than one modality or more than one thing that we can try to help someone with in terms of understanding and then practically doing something that's really quite simple, that's going to help them work on some of the background mechanisms that's driving some of these issues. You know, the other side of it can be the other side of the cognition being not just like stress, anxiety, but the side of like focus, attention, awareness, less brain fog in the afternoon. So rather than me going to reach my cup of coffee, I go and get that panoramic view. So I get outside and look, and rather than holding the cup of coffee and jumping up and down because you're going to spill it on you, you don't need to drink the coffee. You get a few vibrations going, you do some breathing, and maybe you whack your vagus nerve a little bit, and you go back after a couple of minute break. You go back with more. You go back to work with more clarity, understanding that slower breathing going to help with oxygen supply to the brain as well. So you can start to like stack these things in together and start to utilize them more specifically towards the things that you want to try to work on and improve. Okay. Before the final bit that we're going to look at is a little around the neurology of how breathing affects the brain, but from a muscle activation and movement perspective. Okay, that's to come after this around performance. So there's some stuff that we understand from sort of our typical teachings with the Oxford Advantage around improving. Like if someone has a greater tolerance to carbon dioxide, we're going to have better control of our breath. We're not going to be stimulated to breathe quite so fast, and we can stay in control. And we can stay in control, we're able to influence the efficiency of oxygen delivery. And there's some elements that will help us in a athletic setup, but also in stressful situations, depending on what that stress may be. And like we said before, depending on the type of stress that it is, that will influence how the breathing is going to get challenged. But if you go into that challenge with a greater tolerance to CO2, you're a better chance of maintaining control and balance of that. There's, in terms of performance from a sporting perspective, there's a really interesting part from increase at higher intensities, because when we talk about breathing efficiency, a lot of the time it works with like lower level stuff. So like the ultra marathon I'm doing next month, like very low aerobic work, breathing efficiency, nasal breathing, diaphragm breathing. My breathing shouldn't be challenged during it at all, really. And I should be using my breathing to stay in a state of like calm and less stress. And that's manageable because the speed I'm going to be running at or working at is going to be very low. And endurance sports get this. And so I do work with a few sort of like professional cyclists, got someone who's an Ironman, and then and a couple of triathletes I work with, where like the endurance side of it that they get. But a lot of people, say if they're working in CrossFit or functional fitness or rugby players that I work with, where we're working at high intensities and understanding how that acidity that carbon dioxide is creating is influencing our breathing primarily, and that increases as we start working harder. We can better understand how to work on creating greater adaptations for more of the anaerobic type of work that we potentially will be doing to increase performance under fatigue, or reducing our time to fatigue at higher intensity work. So there was a study done in rugby by Warons in 2018, and they replicated it in 2020 with basketball as well, where they were doing breath holding work in sport specific applications. And one of the things that happens when we're working at high intensities where there's less oxygen available, we would call it more, that anaerobic effect, so without oxygen. When we don't have oxygen available readily, some of the H+ ions that get created during metabolism can't get oxidized. So typically during aerobic, they would get oxidized, the H+ ion attached to an oxygen and create water, H2O. When those H+ ions can't be oxidized, they affect the pH. In the lactate mechanism, they will create more lactic acid, lactic ions, which again increase the acidity of the blood. But also, not just really the acidity of the blood, will increase the acidity within the muscle compartments themselves. And so what they've seen is when they are doing anaerobic work, particularly with repeat bouts of effort, so like they were doing repeat sprints of 40 meters in the rugby 2018 paper, every 30 seconds. So if it took them, say, 6 seconds to do the 40-meter sprint, they'd have 24 seconds rest before they were going again. And they split the two groups in the trial into two. One group holding the breath, the other group after an exhale, the other group breathing how they wanted. And the group that were holding their breath increased their repeat sprint ability after just 4 weeks by a factor of 10. They increased by 60%, and the group that weren't holding their breath increased by 6%. 6% increase was that's what you'd expect because you did some training. They were doing just 2 sessions a week, well, they did 7 sessions over the 4 weeks. 2 sessions a week, 1 session in week 1. Now, that starts to become really interesting in sport-specific scenarios or contexts where we're doing higher level intensity stuff, typically where some of the breathing benefits around endurance would be a case of like, oh yeah, but I'm doing more high intensity stuff. Like it's not just endurance that I need that like anaerobic capacity increasing. And breath holding has been shown through a couple of those studies that the more sport specific the breath holding exercise being done is, the greater the benefit or the turnover or the application into their sports, because what they were seeing in the results from those studies was the lactate that was increasing acidity within the muscle compartment wasn't transferring into the blood as quickly for the group that were holding their breath after that 4-week trial, leaving them to theorize that during the 4 weeks of training, when they were holding their breath, they weren't letting carbon dioxide out, so the acidity of the blood was increasing. They were working with lower levels of oxygen. So typically when you mouth breathe, it was high intensity sprints, their mouth breathing would give you like an SpO2 of 93%. Nasal breathing, it might drop to 91. But only when you hold your breath is actually going to get below 90. And you can get some really quite dramatic drops in your SpO2 levels doing some short, maybe 6-7 seconds, but high intensity with low rest. And because you're not letting any more oxygen in, you're increasing the stimulus or adaptation from the lactate that's increasing in the muscle compartments themselves. So we've got this increase in acidity from the carbon dioxide, then we've got in the blood, then we've got an increase in acidity in the muscle compartments from the lactate. And what they'd seen was the group that were holding their breath, the acidity from the muscles wasn't replicating to what they would expect in the blood when they took their blood markers. So their theory being that some of the proteins and the phosphates in those muscle compartments over that 4-week training cycle were starting to get used to like this increase in acidity and actually dealing with it better, buffering it effectively before it then got into the blood, because the acidity in the blood was always already super high because of the breath hold, because they weren't letting the carbon dioxide out, compared to the group that was allowed to just breathe however they wanted. Effectively giving them a double dose of anaerobic work, increasing the stimulus and therefore increasing the adaptation, and remarkably so by like a factor of 10. Like, it's huge. Now that can be, this is somewhere where I'm, in terms of a practical application with some of the rugby teams I work with, looking at how can this help with both injury prevention and rehabilitation protocols, in that you can create a stronger response in terms of anaerobic threshold by working at a lower intensity but holding the breath, compared to working at max. Compared to working at max is where people will you're more likely to get injured when you're working at a threshold than you're working at max. So sprinting at 100% compared to sprinting at 85, 90%, but holding the breath, if the adaptation you're looking for is, I'm not trying to increase maximal speed here, I'm looking to increase repeat sprintability, lactate threshold, time to fatigue, then we can get that and we can lower the risk of injury by introducing the breath hold. So there's one really nice application to it. You can also make them work absolutely flat out and make them hold the breath as well, but you're adding like a double dose of stimulus, so to be done in small bouts. But then the rehabilitation, with one of the head physios I work with, we're having this conversation around what's the most difficult part of the rehabilitation process for an athlete that's been injured for a while, that's been out of the game for a bit, whatever their sport may be. Well, they've become deconditioned from that anaerobic work more so than any of the aerobic work. And the aerobic work isn't like nasty and minging and hard. And it's when they have rehabbed to the point where, okay, you're good enough now, not ready to go back into full things, but you're good enough now to start working at like a reasonable intensity. And at that point can often be a stumbling block, either the flare up of the injury or injure something else as a compensation mechanism, partly because they're just so deconditioned from doing that higher intensity work. Whereas we could keep some level of anaerobic conditioning in terms of the muscular system by utilizing breath holding techniques when they're able to do some really low level aerobic work, maybe just walking or on a stationary bike. So there's real benefit and application in the real world to understanding how this works and how to implement it quite simply. Low level, but holding the breath, I'm going to be getting some, at least reducing the amount of deconditioning of anaerobic work that happens when they can't work at higher intensities. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, quick question.
Yeah.
What was the study with that breath holding?
So that was repeat sprint. It's at the end of this. It was 2018 Warons. It was the title. It's at the end of it. I'll show you at the end of it. But repeat sprintability. Yeah, repeat sprintability. It was in Ireland with 21 professional rugby players. They did another one. The same group of researchers did another one in 2020 with basketball as well. Cool. Last little bits on performance around just literally actually training the respiratory system, rather than in terms of like the muscular system part of it, as opposed to the chemosensitivity. So diaphragm strengthening, like diaphragm resistance work, and appreciating the effect known as like blood stealing, or this metabolic reflex response, where this is just simply is a protective mechanism, like we said, with a few things around. If the diaphragm is starting to fatigue, what the brain does is like, it knows that that's a problem. So it will get as many of those secondary breathing muscles to stay involved. It knows if we stop breathing, we're dead. So we've got to keep going. It will want to shut the system down, ideally, like stop you from working. Hence why doing hard work for a long time is difficult, because the easiest way to get your breathing back under control is just to stop the exercise. But if you're strong-willed and you're like trying to do some stupid challenge or something, you're going to carry on working mentally. But blood will be stolen from your working muscles, if you're running, typically from your legs, and sent to those breathing muscles. More blood to the diaphragm to try and help it, more blood to those secondary breathing muscles. So there's a lot of energy cost to that, and wasted energy. Whereas training the strength of the diaphragm, stronger muscles function better and have greater endurance. So training the strength with some resistance training for your diaphragm, that could be, as for someone that's a mouth breather, that's as simple as using the resistance of your nose. Someone that's got adapted to nasal breathing, that's breathing through one nostril compared to breathing through both nostrils. So just literally, if you just block one nostril now, take a strong breath in, like it's harder to expand. You got to work harder because there's more resistance. And then the exhale, if you breathe out strongly, you've got to work to force the air out. Remember, not flexing the spine when you do that, just making the ribs articulate to it. And then you can get a little bit more technical with like the sports mask that we use with the Oxygen Advantage, or there's some mouth ones that a few different companies have generated. But just if you do play around with those, just understanding like, if you're breathing, like, are you training to breathe with the mouth, or are you training to breathe with the nose? And it might be like, I've got a professional rugby player that, he's at a high level, like plays for England. He needs the ability to breathe well and strongly with his mouth, and well and strongly with his nose. So he has got both a mouthpiece and doesn't use them both at the same time, but he's got a mouthpiece, the AeroFit, and he's got the sports mask to be able to work on both. And then the final bit was, so that's been shown to be like, if you improve the strength of the diaphragm, you can help to improve its function, you help to improve its endurance. There's also been some interesting studies starting to be done now, and ultimately the conclusion of a lot of these studies, so this one from Taylor in 2015, is like more needs to be done in terms of investigating it. But not just resistance training for the diaphragm itself, but what about using resistance breathing as part of a warm-up protocol to actually warm up the respiratory muscles, give them a little bit of, I'm going to say like pre-tensioning. I don't mean that, I sort of do. I'm thinking more like, if anyone, comes back from my strength and conditioning days, if you were to, someone to do some like max strength like work in terms of like, say, squats, and one of the things that we might do is have them do some vertical jumps beforehand, which is like sort of priming work, like trying to prime the nervous system to fire, so that then going into a strength, even though a vertical jump has nothing to do with strength other than nervous system firing, it's helping that nervous system wire up to then actually go and do the thing. If we're the same, I'm thinking along the same lines with this approach. We're going like, okay, if I'm going to do some hard training, some hard work, and I'm going to ask the breathing muscles to do a lot of work, like it would be useful to warm them up beforehand, and potentially like give them some work to do, so that then that's with some resistance that's a little bit harder, getting them activating them and working them a little bit harder, and then take them into the thing that they're going to, into the competition or the sport or the exercise, the training session, the thing they're about to do. So the respiratory warm-up, they call it, so using something like the sports mask to provide some resistance. A couple of things that were noted in this is like, yes, it could be beneficial and has been shown to be beneficial. There are a few caveats in that the amount of restriction seems to be specific to the individual. So they've not like, there's not a set criteria yet. So it's in that stage of like using it on its own, fine. Using it specifically in the warm-up, give them too much restriction, it will diminish the performance. Not enough restriction doesn't really make any difference. So there's that like sweet spot, that Goldilocks, which they're saying, obviously then more research to find out how do you successfully find that sweet spot for your athlete that you're working with, as opposed to just trial and error. But some interesting elements there. But again, thinking rationally, like that makes sense, doesn't it? If I want my breathing muscles to work hard, if I absolutely smash them before I go and do something, well, they're going to be starting fatigued. No difference to if you like you wanted to go and do some heavy squats and then start it. I'm going to warm up with like really heavy. Like, no, you need to build up into it, and you don't want to pre-exhaust what you do. So it makes rational sense, and the same concept of going, oh, well, actually, like a little bit of work for them to warm them up, and activate them. Well, that's going to be beneficial. Like, don't do too much. If you don't do enough, it's not going to make it's not really going to make any difference. But an interesting area that they're still looking to develop. Do I think that people will be utilizing that at the top level? Yes, potentially. But do I think that people can benefit from some resisted breathing work, as simple as like breathing through one nostril at the end of a training session? Yeah, like everyone can benefit from that. It's a very simple one to do. Like, you finish your training session, you breathe through one nostril, you notice like that you have to breathe harder on the way in, and you have to work on the way out. And you work on that spinal alignment that I talked about right at the beginning, and work on strengthening the mechanics and the muscle, the inhalation and exhalation muscles that are needed to do those movements. Beneficial after the end of a session, definitely, as part of your cool down. And that's something that is dead easy to integrate into, and that's something that then could be utilized widespread. So application of those things, before we finish, just looking at a little bit of on the movement. Whether it's a specific breathing technique or breath work, whatever breath work means, like it means something different to everybody, potentially. But what I hope that people will do is take this information and ask themselves, be able to ask these questions and give themselves better answers from understanding a little bit better. And if you're a coach or a breathwork facilitator, or whatever you call yourself, that you are able to answer this question for the person that you're working with or prescribing stuff to them. So what is the technique doing to my physiology, or what is the technique doing to their physiology? Like, why am I suggesting we do this, or why am I wanting to do this? Like, what is the purpose of the technique? What is this trying to actually do? What is it influencing? And therefore, am I prescribing the best thing for that purpose or for that outcome that we're after? And is the exercise what my body needs right now? Like, does it need more parasympathetic or sympathetic? Does it need a stress? Does it need to relax? What is it that the body needs? Does it need to get rid of carbon dioxide, or does it need to hold it in? And starting to understand what's going on better, or at a slightly deeper level, so that you can utilize it better for yourself or for people that you're working in. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool. Okay. Last little bit then is on brain activation. So, and this is not brain stem for influencing the breathing pattern like we were talking about, but we are going to visit the same parts of the brain stem. But in neurology, it gets complicated. So I'm going to try and keep it simple. But they basically like split the body in two, and you have the left-hand side of the brain, the right-hand side of the brain, the left-hand side of the body, the right-hand side of the body, and it works on a contralateral, meaning like the right-hand side activates the left-hand side of the brain. So my right-hand side is working on the left-hand side of the brain. Now, the right-hand side of my automatic function, so my right hand breathing being, and my conscious choice of movement of the right-hand side being, both of those being dictated by the left-hand side of my brain. The automatic function of my breathing muscles on the left-hand side, and my conscious movement of the left-hand side activates the right-hand side of the brain. That makes sense? So if I'm right-handed and use my right hand for wiping my arse and eating my food or whatever else I do with my right hand, I do a lot more with my right hand than I do with my left. Yeah. And so my left-hand side of the brain is getting a lot more activation throughout the day compared to the right. And that left-hand side of my brain is influencing the automatic function or the activity of breathing muscles on my right-hand side, as well as anything else that's automatic. Does that make sense? So if I'm right-handed, it might be easier for me to breathe into this right-hand side, okay, from a muscle activation point of view, okay? So what I want you to do is stand up. Okay, put your, well, actually first, without your hands there. You'll think this is, no, without your hands, hands have to be down by the side, just shake them like that. You might think this is crazy, but you're like, okay, just try and breathe in to your right hand side. So just breathe into your right lung. Like, can you? I don't know. What does it feel like to you? You answer that question. And then try, okay, now try, can you breathe into the left? And was there any differences? Did you notice or feel any difference? Okay. Touch and sensory input. We have a lot of receptors around the skin. Touch is very interesting. You should put your hands now on the sides. And when feel the right hand side with that hand, I'm going to try and inflate just this right hand side. And I feel like, oh yeah. With my hand there, I felt like that hand was moving more than this one. Then try the left hand side. Can you get the left hand one moving? Okay, you can stay there whilst I'll take you through a couple of sides. Just have a play with that and just notice you and you can feedback in the chat box if you want to. Of like, did you feel like with your hands there, you was able to feel it a bit more, and maybe one feels a bit stuck, one doesn't. Are you right handed and the right one feels better or not? Like, does the left one move better? Like, what are you noticing when you try to breathe into one side than the other? Some differences within the system. I'll just pause this when we're on our back side. This is looking at from the behind. So the right hand side, because it doesn't need the gap for the heart, is bigger than the left hand side. And if you remember what we saw back with the diaphragm, this is just on a slightly different on a little graphic. The diaphragm on the right hand side has a longer and thicker attachment to the spine and is slightly bigger than the left hand side because of the space the left needs for the heart. Okay, so what I want you to try and do is whichever side. So if you are right-handed, so the right side being larger. We were looking at the back of the person there. The right side being larger. So the right lung and the right diaphragm is slightly larger, and there's a thicker attachment on the right side. And added, if you're right-handed, it can feel you've got more brain activation on the left, which gives you more activation of those muscles on the right. So for a lot of us, it will feel easier to breathe into the right than it is to breathe into the left. Whichever, if that is the case, rub the side on the left. But if it was the right that was hard, rub the other side. So whichever side felt hardest, rub that side. Like, stimulate the skin on that side. Rub it, rub it, rub it, rub it. Then let go. And then feel where you are rubbing. Like, feel it. Like that skin's like buzzing. And then try to make, as you inhale, try to move that area where you are rubbing. Because we have so many receptors in the skin, literally just the act of rubbing and waking them up, you know, for sometimes it'll be a case of like, okay, I'm quite good at breathing low down the diaphragm. But actually, when I start to take a bigger breath, I feel really stuck up on, this is a classic one for me, that left-hand side is really tight and it doesn't expand. If I have to take a bigger breath in, the left-hand side feels tight and stuck. Like rubbing and activating the skin on that area just to tell the brain, start to map to the brain, this is an area I want you to move and be able to breathe into. And then when I take a bigger breath, can I get those ribs expanding more as well? And literally just by the sensation of touch, it's starting to map to your brain, which can be very, very simple one to do. The other bit that I want us to do around muscle activation is this concept that on functional MRIs scans, they've shown that specific types of breathing, and we're just going to look at two, which are the two simplest and I think most applicable for people, is how a specific active breathing can light up, let's say activate different areas of the brain. Now, we go back to then our pons and medulla. Remember the pons being effective on that, like the size of the breath. And when you actually do a big breath in, as it's feeling that stretch sensation, it tries to inhibit the medulla. When we do a very strong inhalation, really strong, you might do a series of them like in, that pons is getting like excited because it doesn't like that stretch, and you're just going to try and keep pushing it. And that helps to actually, and what they've shown on, this is what they've shown the functional MRIs, is that activation of the pons helps with global, so all body parts of extension tone, predominantly like extension tone being on like the back side of the body. The forceful exhalations work on the opposite. So a forceful exhale activates more flexion tone. And they've shown that that's happening from the medulla. So there's obviously some sort of exhalation process going on in the medulla as part of that forceful part, which we showed at the beginning on forceful inhalation, exhalation. We're not going to be exhaling, we're just going to choose to breathe forcefully, okay? Now, we can use this to our advantage, or it can, in terms of thinking rationally, it can make sense in that strong inhales help with extension, opening. Well, that makes sense if you think that like inhaling, the ribs are opening up and widening. It is extension. It's like, okay, we're just going to do it forcefully. Exhalations are flexion when we're talking about the ribs. When we're doing forcefully, we're getting some overall flexion changes. Now, if you're trying to move into a more extended and open position, we can use our breath very simply to do that. If you're trying to go into a more flexed position, so you're trying to touch your toes and you force the air out, you can increase the flexion tone, which is going to help us to go into that. The thing I want to do with you is put these two things together at the same time, okay? So effectively our breathing can affect muscle activation, which is then going to affect the movement. Because breathing is being contained in the ribs, the rib movement will affect your spine because your ribs connect into your spine. Your spine affects your pelvis and your shoulder blades sit on your rib cage. So all of this has the potential to affect your hips, your spine, and your shoulders, as well as the movement we're going to go into, okay? So what we're going to do is stand up, and I want you to just test a couple of very simple things, just for you to get a bit of an idea for yourself. I want you to take a massive, biggest breath in that you can, start low down, and I want you to see how long your exhale can be. I want you to feel how big your inhale feels, but how long your exhale can be, okay? So just to have an idea of like how doing something with your ribs can influence the size of breath that you can take, because the more you can mobilize your ribs, the more space you can create for your lungs to expand. So I'm going to start low, but take the biggest breath in that I can. How did that feel? And then how slow? And how long can I exhale for? And you can specifically time it, but just get a gauge of that and we'll retest it at the end. Okay, so how big did it feel? And how long was the exhale? The longer you can exhale for, okay, CO2, but we're not going to change CO2. how long you can exhale for will also be influenced by how much air you breathed in the first place. So if I help you take a bigger breath, you'll notice at the end you'll be able to slow your breath down. The other thing being then, other movements, just take your arms overhead, see how the shoulders feel, look above your head and notice where they are on the ceiling. And then just a little rotation one, arms out like this, internal rotation, external rotation. Okay, and then the final one, try to come down to touch your toes. Where do you, maybe be able to see me just go down. Where can you get to in terms of touching your toes? Okay, right. Now what we're going to do is nothing on any of those things, but you're going to see how it affects, see how it changes things. You're going to stand feet hip width apart. You're going to take one arm out, okay, and you're going to rotate to the side. Do the same arm as me. Well, actually, just first one, watch me do it. Okay, just watch this. So my right arm's going to go up. I'm going to rotate as far as I can to the right, and I'm going to get stuck into my hand just by that picture. Okay, I'm stuck. Now, in order for me to move to the right and rotate to the right, my ribs on the right need to move to the right. And the ribs on the right, to the right, is the ribs moving away from the spine. Yeah? Ribs on the left also need to go to the right, but the ribs going towards the right is the ribs going to the spine. So they're doing opposite things. This one is going away from the spine, this one's going to the spine. Opening up away from the spine, inhalation on the right hand side helps that movement, rib movement. On the left, ribs going towards the spine, that's more flexion. So I'm going to use my understanding of how the ribs move when I breathe and do it forcefully, strongly, to facilitate extension on the right hand side, flexion on the left hand side. And we'll see what happens. So the forceful inhale, I'm going to try to do it on the right. It'll be like this, through the nose, in, and then the exhale is going to be out of the left. Okay, breathing out of the mouth. Imagine it's your 100th birthday, and you're going to blow out all the candles. But I'm going to do it in this rotation pattern. So if you watch, I rotate to the side, feet don't move, but just I rotate as far as I can. My hand gets stuck there, I can't go further, then I breathe into the right. Okay, in, move the ribs as much as I can, then force the air out the left. And I've gone from there to there. By getting the spine moving, by the rib moving, and using the breath to change extension tone and flexion tone, because one side of the body is wanting to go into extension, the other into flexion. Okay, so try with me. Go left arm. So I'm going to swap over. Go left. So left arm up, rotate to the left and get stuck. Oh God, I feel really tight on this side now. See where you get stuck. No, you can't go any further. You breathe in as strongly to the left as you can. So in. Move that air, move the ribs with the air, and then force the air out of the right. And use those ribs coming down and in to make that rotation happen and feel yourself rotate a little bit further. In that new position you're at, so hold that position, do one more time, do it again. Okay, so go in that new position, breathe in, and then force the air out. Ribs down and in, facilitate that rotation. Yeah, and you've moved again. Good. And then try the right hand side. So right hand up, rotate to the right, get stuck, breathe into the right. In. Use the air to move the ribs and then force the air out the left. And that exhale, the ribs drive, ribs coming down and in, drive in that movement. In that new position you're in, do one final one. So you've done 2 on each side. Yeah, once you've done 2 on each side, just retest. Take your arms up. Like have your shoulder flexion, the arms further back than they were before. Does your rotation feel easier? Even we haven't done anything on the hips, but do you come down and can you actually touch lower down on the floor than you were before. Not necessarily always for everyone, but depending on how your current breathing is at. But then this one, particularly, whilst you're stood up, take the biggest breath in you can now, starting low down. And does it feel like you expanded more? And importantly, is your exhale longer? So if I try and start low down, I'll try and take a big breath in. Did it feel like it was bigger? And then slowly out. Am I able to control a longer exhale because we just asked you to move your ribs further and you did that, and then now it feels easier to get them expanding more. Yeah, just drop any things you noted in the chat box for us, and then just as you can just input in as I summarize. So in summary, we only know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. In that, like, this is some stuff, like there'll be more stuff that will come that people will find out, and then we'll try and learn from them effectively. And I think that just having an appreciation of that is good. Breathing has the potential to be involved in many processes within the body. Therefore, breathing can impact these functions. Like, it works both ways. It's one of the things that's always on in the background. Yeah. And then those four, we didn't do them in these 4 areas, but they're the 4 areas I'd say them. I think they sound: think, feel, move, perform, flows, for whatever reason in my mind. So in terms of thinking, we're looking at like cognitive function, which might be focus, attention, but also stress, anxiety side of it. But the brain, the stress effect, and CO2 influencing them. Nervous system, vagal tone, having an effect on how we actually feel. In terms of moving, what we did then, like hopefully you notice like the spine, hips and shoulders can get influenced by just some breathing exercises. The breathing in that scenario can be used as a tool to increase extensor and flexor tone. And so if you understand when whatever movement you're doing, taking your arm, like that's flexion, arm behind you, extension, going down to touch your toes, that's flexion, doing a bridge, that's extension, like understanding like internal rotation is flexion, external rotation is extension. Whatever thing you're trying to do, your breath can help facilitate better control of the flexor extension tones around that joint, which can help facilitate movement when you're trying to open up and move. The nice thing about getting the ribs moving a little bit further is increasing the size of breath that you can take is going to be beneficial for those involved in a sporting context. And even just getting the ribs moving more makes the easier, gentle breathing even nicer in effect. You've expanded where they can go to. And then the perform side of things in terms of exercise performance, like CO2 sensitivity or tolerance, and then that lactate threshold that can be trained through breath holding, and then that importance on diaphragm strength and endurance were some of the key things that we did. There, I'll send these through to you on email, so you've got them. But that's the repeated sprint training in hypoxia induced by voluntary hyperventilation improves running repeated sprint ability in rugby players. European Journal of Sports Science. That's that one. But I'll send these through to you. And some books and those courses I recommended at the start. I'll send through all these slides so you've got them. Yeah. And then I think the other thing I was just going to say, I've got, if anyone isn't certified and is interested in the Oxford Master certification, I'm teaching my next one, or halfway through the current one, but next one that you can sign up to starts in January. Details are on the rootedlife.co.uk website. I do it over 9 weeks online, 2 hours per week, over 9 weeks. And if you haven't got the Pro Breathwork app, there's a free foundations course within there, as well as some other bits and pieces, but the foundations course is there. You can track things like your Bolt score, your respiratory rate, your max breath holds, those types of things, and then simple exercises that you can follow along and listen to. And or even if you like, your clients might find it beneficial. The foundations courses nails all the basics of like the biochemistry, the biomechanics, just some simple drills that people can listen to or follow along with. Has anyone got any? Jane had to unzip your dress, as in what? Because your rotation was so good, or your dress was tight. Okay, because you started to breathe in. Nice. Yes, I no idea. We can breathe into one side more than the other, and yeah, exactly. Like the breathing in sync with your movement in flexion and extension tones they utilize in yoga. They just wouldn't have described it to us as like, oh, we're doing neurology. Yeah, James Ness's book Breath is a great one. There was one other. Did I mention the other? Yes, I did. There's another book. This is a really good one. Let me go back to it. So I'll send you these. Recognizing and treating breathing disorders. Google that, or Amazon on that. It's like a proper decent textbook, so it's about 40-50 quid. It's not cheap, but it's good. Lots of stuff written by like physio, osteopath, a range of different people. It's not just that one guy. Yeah, covers off in quite a few different modalities of people looking at breathing. If you haven't checked that one out, yeah.
You're going to send us the slides, are you?
Yeah, I'll send the slides so you can see them. Yes, you don't have to write all them down. Cool. Any changes in movement from people? When did you notice yourself rotating more? As one simple one. Yeah, nice. Cool. Anyone got any final questions? If you think of stuff afterwards, you can always just email me. But thanks.
I was just going to ask.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask on the premenstrual side of things. I find that I have to use breath work a lot at that time, and otherwise I don't really need to use it heavily because I've sort of retrained my breath. I'm conscious of it all the time, and I'm gently adapting it all day. But that's when it's like a complete bugger.
Yeah.
So have you done much work on that? Is that a space that you've tapped into very much, or is it just a space you've literally come across occasionally?
No, so my wife, who's an Oxford Advantage instructor, she's big into it, and then also Georgie Lawler, she's another master instructor, and she's got a female breathing course with the Oxford Advantage.
I think I know Georgie.
Yeah. So she's delved deep into it. So she's got a course that's good. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
For sure. Yeah, no worries, Jane. Thank you. Cool. Thank you, everyone. If you got any questions, you've got my email. I'll send these. I'll send the replay and the slides on so you can check them out.
Thank you, David.
Thanks for joining. Take care, guys. God bless.
Thanks very much, Jacko.
Cheers, man. Bye.